a churchgoer, notices a stray dog entering the church daily. When the priest follows him, he discovers a secret that touches him deeply and reveals a connection between the dog and a departed loved one. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Church in Maplewood, casting colored patterns across the worn wooden pews. Father John Matthews sat in the first row, his morning prayers interrupted by the distinct sound of claws clicking against the marble floor. He turned his head slowly, expecting to see one of his parishioners' pets that had wandered in by mistake. Instead, he saw a medium-sized, mixed-breed dog with golden brown fur, slightly matted but clean enough to suggest someone was looking after him. The dog moved with purpose, his nose close to the ground, tracking an invisible path through the church's main aisle. Father John remained still, watching as the animal navigated the space with familiar ease. The dog paused briefly, lifting his head to look directly at Father John. His brown eyes held an intelligence that made the priest catch his breath. Without any sign of fear or hesitation, the dog continued his journey, moving past the main altar toward the side chapel. Father John's curiosity got the better of him. He stood quietly and followed the dog, maintaining a respectful distance. The side chapel had become an unofficial memorial space over the past few months. Parishioners often left flowers, cards, and photos of their departed loved ones. As he rounded the corner, he saw the dog sitting perfectly still in front of one particular collection of memories. The memorial was different from the others. Fresh flowers were arranged carefully around a framed photograph of a young woman with a bright smile. Her dark hair was caught mid-motion, as if someone had captured her in a moment of laughter. The name Emily Harrison was written in elegant script on a card propped against the frame. Father John approached slowly, not wanting to disturb the dog's vigil. The animal didn't move, his eyes fixed on Emily's photograph. Scattered around the frame were several handwritten letters, their edges curled from frequent handling. Father John knelt beside the dog, who acknowledged his presence with a slight tail wag, but maintained his focus on the photograph. With gentle hands, Father John picked up one of the letters. The paper was thick, high-quality stationery, and the handwriting was neat but emotional, evident in the varying pressure of the pen strokes. He began to read. "Dear Emily, it's been 3 months since you left us. Buddy still waits by the door every evening at 6, just like he used to when you'd come home from work. He refuses to eat from any bowl except the blue one you bought him last Christmas. Sometimes I wonder if dogs understand death the way we do, or if their understanding is somehow purer, more accepting. The neighborhood feels empty without your morning runs with Buddy, without your laughter echoing down the street." Father John looked at the dog Buddy with new understanding. This wasn't a random stray seeking shelter. This was a regular visitor paying respects to someone he had loved. The priest noticed small details he had missed before: the worn blue collar without tags, the gray starting to show around Buddy's muzzle, the patient, almost reverent way he sat before the memorial. As Father John continued to kneel there, more questions formed in his mind. Who was taking care of Buddy now? How often did he make this pilgrimage to the church? What had happened to Emily? The letter had hinted at a sudden departure, but offered no details about the circumstances of her death. The morning light shifted, creating a warm glow around Emily's photograph. Buddy finally moved, standing up slowly as if his private communion was complete. He turned to Father John, and for a moment, they shared a look of mutual recognition, two beings who understood the weight of loss and the power of dedication. Without a sound, Buddy walked back down the aisle, his mission apparently complete for the day. Father John remained by the memorial, watching as Buddy disappeared through the church doors that had been left ajar. Something about the dog's quiet devotion had touched him deeply, stirring memories of his own losses and the ways grief could manifest in unexpected forms. He made a mental note to ask his parishioners about Emily Harrison and her faithful companion. There was a story here that needed to be told, a mystery that pulled at his heart in ways he couldn't yet understand. Father John spent the next few days asking discreet questions about Emily Harrison and Buddy. Each conversation revealed fragments of their story, building a picture of a beloved community member and her devoted dog. But it was the recurring sight of Buddy's daily visits that truly catalyzed his decision to act. On a Wednesday evening, Father John stood before his parish council, his proposal prepared. The church basement, usually reserved for bake sales and Bible study, was filled with curious faces. He had called an emergency meeting, something he rarely did in his 5 years at St. Michael's. "I've called you here today because I believe we have an opportunity to honor Emily Harrison's memory in a meaningful way," he began, his voice steady. "Many of you have noticed the dog Buddy, who visits our church daily. His dedication has made me realize we can do more for the animals in our community who, like him, need our help." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Father John outlined his plan for a fundraising campaign to support the local animal shelter. He explained how Emily had been a regular volunteer there, and how combining her memory with this cause seemed fitting. As he spoke, the basement door creaked open, and heads turned to see Buddy padding in, followed by a woman Father John hadn't met before. "I'm sorry we're late," the woman said, her voice slightly breathless. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. I was Emily's best friend." She took a seat in the back row, Buddy settling at her feet. Father John noticed her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her glasses. The meeting continued, but the energy in the room had shifted. When Sarah raised her hand to speak, there was a collective lean forward, an unspoken recognition of her connection to Emily. "Emily would have loved this," Sarah began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "She always said that animals have a way of healing broken hearts. The day she found Buddy in the shelter, she told me it was like finding a piece of herself she didn't know was missing." Sarah paused, collecting herself. "The last time I saw her, she was planning to organize a shelter fundraiser herself." The room fell silent, heavy with the weight of what could have been. Father John watched as several council members wiped away tears. Mrs. Henderson, the church treasurer, was already pulling out her checkbook. "We'll call it Love and Hope," Father John announced, the name coming to him suddenly, "because that's what Emily gave to Buddy and what he continues to give to us." He outlined the initial plans, a series of events culminating in a large adoption fair, partnerships with local businesses, and a memorial wall featuring success stories from the shelter. As the meeting progressed, people began offering resources and connections. The owner of the local print shop volunteered to handle promotional materials. A real estate agent offered to help secure venues for events. The owner of the downtown cafe promised to donate proceeds from a special Emily's Blend coffee. Sarah stayed quiet through most of the planning, but Father John noticed how she took detailed notes, occasionally nodding or smiling softly. Buddy remained at her feet, his head resting on her shoes, a living connection to the friend she had lost. After the meeting, as people filed out with assignments and commitments, Sarah approached Father John. "Thank you," she said simply, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Emily always said this church felt like home, even though she wasn't particularly religious. Now, I understand why." Father John watched as she and Buddy left together, their silhouettes merging with the growing dusk. He felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. The campaign would be more than just fundraising. It would be a way for the community to heal, to transform their collective grief into action. That night, as he prepared for bed, Father John heard barking outside. Looking out his window, he saw Buddy and Sarah walking past the church, their evening routine now including a moment of pause at the building steps. He realized that in trying to help heal others, he might find healing himself. The campaign was just beginning, but already it felt like something significant was shifting in Maplewood. The next few weeks would require careful planning and coordination, but Father John felt ready for the challenge. Emily's memory, Buddy's devotion, and Sarah's quiet strength would guide the way. The Love and Hope campaign quickly became Father John's primary focus outside his regular pastoral duties. He found himself spending increasing amounts of time with Sarah, their shared commitment to honoring Emily's memory creating a natural partnership. Their first major planning session took place in the church office, with Buddy sleeping contentedly under the desk. Emily used to say that organizing events was like conducting an orchestra, Sarah mentioned, spreading paperwork across Father John's worn oak desk. Every element needs to harmonize. Her business background proved invaluable as she transformed their ideas into actionable plans. Father John noticed how she would occasionally reach down to touch Buddy, as if drawing strength from his presence. The dog had become a bridge between them, his quiet presence making difficult conversations easier. They discussed Emily often, but also shared stories from their own lives. Sarah spoke of her marketing career in the city and why she'd returned to Maplewood. Father John found himself sharing experiences from his early days as a priest, including his doubts and struggles. Their first major campaign event was a visit to the local animal shelter. The morning was crisp, and Sarah arrived early, carrying coffee for both of them. 2 sugars, right? She asked, handing him a cup. He was surprised she'd remembered from a casual mention days earlier. The shelter was a modest building on the outskirts of town, its concrete walls brightened by murals of playing animals. Inside, the reality of what they were fighting for became clear. Cages lined the walls, each containing animals hoping for a second chance. Some were elderly, others injured, all in need of the kind of love Emily had given Buddy. Emily volunteered here every Saturday, Sarah explained as they toured the facility. She could tell you the story of every animal here. Her voice caught slightly. The day she found Buddy, he was scheduled to be euthanized. She said his eyes spoke to her soul. Father John watched as Buddy walked beside them, pausing at certain cages, his tail wagging in recognition of old friends. The shelter manager, a tired-looking woman named Marie, showed them the overcrowded conditions and shared stories of animals who had been saved and those they'd lost. "We're operating at 150% capacity," Marie explained, leading them to a small office cluttered with donation boxes. "Emily used to help us write grant proposals. Marie paused, composing herself. "Well, we've been struggling." The visit affected them both deeply. In the parking lot afterward, Sarah turned to Father John, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I've been avoiding this place," she admitted. "Everything here reminds me of her." Without thinking, Father John reached out and squeezed her hand. The touch was brief but comforting. Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of shared pain and shared purpose. Buddy, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, pressed against their legs, creating a circle of connection. As they worked together over the next few weeks, their interactions took on a different quality. There were lingering glances, conversations that stretched longer than necessary, and a growing awareness of each other's presence. During one late-night planning session, Sarah brought dinner from the local diner, and they ended up sharing stories over cooling coffee long after the work was done. But beneath their growing connection lay a complex web of emotions. Father John struggled with his role as both priest and friend, while Sarah occasionally pulled back, caught in memories of Emily. Buddy remained their constant companion, his unwavering presence both a comfort and a reminder of what they'd lost. The campaign gained momentum, but their personal relationship remained in a delicate balance. During a community meeting, Father John caught himself watching Sarah as she presented their fundraising goals. Her passion and intelligence shone through, and he felt a familiar tug in his chest, followed by a wave of guilt. Sarah, too, seemed to be wrestling with complicated feelings. Sometimes she would start to say something, then stop herself, redirecting the conversation to safer topics. The ghost of Emily hung between them, both binding them together and keeping them apart. One evening, as they walked Buddy around the church grounds, Sarah stopped suddenly. "Emily would want us to be happy," she said quietly, then quickly added, "all of us." The whole community, I mean. The moment hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Father John nodded, understanding both what was said and what wasn't. They continued their walk in companionable silence, Buddy trotting ahead, leading them forward even as they struggled with the past. The community service Father John organized was scheduled for a Sunday evening, deliberately separate from regular Mass. He wanted to create a space where people could speak freely about loss and healing, regardless of their religious beliefs. The church filled quickly, with familiar faces and newcomers drawn by the campaign's growing reputation. Wooden pews creaked under the weight of expectation as Father John stood at the pulpit. Buddy lay near the altar, his presence now accepted as natural by the congregation. Sarah sat in the front row, a notebook open on her lap, though she hadn't written a word. "Tonight isn't about preaching," Father John began, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the church. "Tonight is about sharing our stories, about understanding that grief doesn't have to be a solitary journey." He stepped away from the pulpit, choosing instead to stand closer to his congregation. The first person to speak was Mrs. Rodriguez, who had rarely participated in church events before. She stood shakily, her aged hands gripping the pew in front of her. "I lost my Coco 3 months ago," she said, her accent thick with emotion. 17 years she was with me. After my Fernando passed, she was all I had." As she spoke about her elderly cat, Buddy got up and walked slowly to her pew. He sat beside her, leaning gently against her legs. Mrs. Rodriguez's tears fell freely as she reached down to pat his head. "Animals know," she whispered. "They understand our hearts." Others began to share their stories. Mr. Peterson, the hardware store owner, spoke about the German shepherd who had guarded his store for 12 years. A teenage girl described the rabbit who had helped her through her parents' divorce. Each story wove together, creating a tapestry of love and loss that hung in the air like evening light through stained glass. Then Martha Chen, who ran the local bakery, stood up. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I was there the day Emily found Buddy," she said, causing a ripple of attention through the congregation. "I was dropping off day-old bread at the shelter. She was sitting in front of his cage, just talking to him. She looked up at me and said, 'Sometimes love doesn't make sense on paper, but it makes sense in your heart.'" Father John watched as Sarah's hand moved to her throat, a gesture he'd come to recognize as her way of holding back emotion. Buddy, who had been making his way through the congregation, returned to her side. The service continued, stories flowing like a gentle river of shared experience. People spoke of pets current and lost, of the ways animals had saved them, changed them, helped them grow. But underneath all the stories ran a current of something larger, the recognition of a community's need to connect, to share, to heal together. An elderly man named George, who Father John had never seen in church before, spoke last. His voice was gruff with age and emotion. "I used to see Emily and Buddy walking every morning at dawn. Always thought I'd stop and say hello one day. Now I can't. But watching that dog, still making his rounds, still loving so faithfully, it reminds me that some things don't end with death." As the service concluded, people lingered, forming small groups, exchanging phone numbers, making plans to meet. Father John observed as Mrs. Rodriguez and Martha Chen exchanged contact information, planning a coffee date. The teenage girl who'd spoken about her rabbit was surrounded by other young people, no longer alone in her grief. Sarah approached Father John as the church slowly emptied. "This was exactly what Emily would have wanted," she said softly. "She always said animals bring people together in ways nothing else can." Looking around at the remaining clusters of people, all connected by their shared stories, Father John understood what she meant. The campaign wasn't just about raising money anymore. It had become a catalyst for healing, a way for people to find each other through their shared experiences of love and loss. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Father John sat alone in the church, Buddy's story still echoing in his mind. The dog's dedication had sparked something in Maplewood, awakening a need for connection that had been dormant. As he locked up the church, he saw two women from the service walking together, deep in conversation, and smiled. Sometimes healing came in unexpected ways, through the simple act of sharing stories and recognizing oneself in another's pain. The idea for the adoption fair came during one of Sarah and Father John's regular planning meetings. They had been reviewing the campaign's success when Sarah pulled out a worn photograph from her purse. Emily, at last year's county fair, surrounded by shelter dogs. She always said events like these show people that love is worth the risk, Sarah explained, her fingers tracing the edge of the photo. Even knowing how much it hurts to lose them, Father John studied the image, noting Emily's radiant smile. Then, we'll make this fair a tribute to her spirit, he decided. The planning began immediately, with the church parking lot designated as the venue and local businesses pledging support. As they worked together, the dynamic between Sarah and Father John continued to evolve. Their conversations flowed more easily, punctuated by shared glances and understanding smiles, yet both maintained a careful distance, aware of the complexities of their situation. The day of the fair dawned clear and cool. Volunteers arrived early, setting up tents and equipment. Sarah orchestrated the layout with precise attention to detail, while Father John coordinated with the shelter staff, bringing in the animals. Buddy supervised it all, moving between them as if ensuring everything met his approval. By mid-morning, the church grounds had transformed. Blue and white tents dotted the parking lot, each housing different activities. Local vendors set up food stands, the air filling with the smell of coffee and fresh-baked goods. Martha Chen's bakery tent displayed dog-shaped cookies, with proceeds going to the shelter. The first visitors arrived just as Sarah finished hanging a large banner reading Love and Hope Adoption Fair, in memory of Emily Harrison. The photograph from her county fair victory was displayed prominently, her smile watching over the proceedings. Stories began to unfold throughout the day. An elderly man, recently widowed, found connection with a senior cat who had lost her previous owner. A single mother and her shy daughter bonded with a three-legged dog who showed no signs of being limited by his disability. Each adoption seemed to carry its own message of hope and healing. During a quiet moment, Sarah found Father John watching the proceedings from the church steps. Emily would have loved this chaos, she said, settling beside him. Buddy lay at their feet, content in the summer warmth. I've been afraid, Sarah admitted suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Afraid to let myself care too much about anything or anyone. After Emily, she trailed off, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Father John understood the weight of her words, feeling their echo in his own heart. Fear is natural, he replied carefully, but so is hope. Their shoulders touched briefly, a moment of connection that spoke more than words could express. The conversation was interrupted by excited barking from the adoption area. A family had just signed papers to adopt a pair of senior dogs who couldn't bear to be separated. The sight brought tears to Sarah's eyes, but this time they were accompanied by a smile. As the day progressed, more success stories emerged. The shelter manager reported that more animals had found homes in one day than in the previous month combined. People lingered at Emily's memorial board, sharing memories and adding notes of their own. Late afternoon brought a spontaneous gathering under the main tent. People who had adopted animals shared their stories, creating a tapestry of new beginnings born from loss. Mrs. Rodriguez spoke about her new kitten, her voice strong with renewed purpose. The teenage girl who had lost her rabbit proudly introduced her newly adopted guinea pig. Father John watched as Sarah moved through the crowd, her professional demeanor occasionally cracking to reveal raw emotion. She stopped at each adoption station, taking pictures and collecting stories, building a record of the day Emily's legacy had helped create. As the fair wound down, volunteers began the cleanup process. Sarah and Father John found themselves sorting through donation boxes, their hands occasionally brushing as they worked. The touch no longer carried the same awkwardness it once had, replaced by a comfortable familiarity. "We need to talk," Sarah said finally, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. "About everything we've been avoiding." Father John nodded, understanding that they had reached a turning point. The success of the fair had shown them both that new beginnings were possible, even in the shadow of loss. Buddy, who had been dozing nearby, lifted his head and watched them with knowing eyes. In his faithful presence, they found the courage to begin addressing the feelings that had been growing between them, complicated by grief, duty, and the memory of Emily. The evening after the fair, Father John found himself drawn to Emily's memorial altar. The space had evolved over the weeks, growing with added photos and notes from community members. He sat in the dimly lit chapel, the events of the day weighing on his mind. The success of the fair should have left him feeling triumphant. Instead, he felt a complex mixture of emotions he couldn't quite untangle. Sarah's words, "We need to talk," echoed in his thoughts, carrying both promise and uncertainty. The wooden bench creaked as he shifted, his collar feeling unusually tight around his neck. A familiar clicking of nails on marble announced Buddy's arrival. The dog had developed an uncanny ability to appear during these moments of deep reflection. He sat beside Father John, placing his head on the priest's knee, a gesture that seemed both comforting and questioning. What would Emily think of all this? Father John asked aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. The question wasn't just about the fair or the campaign. It was about everything. The way the community had come together, the stories that had been shared, and most complicated of all, the growing connection between him and Sarah. He reached for one of the newer notes attached to Emily's photo. The handwriting was shaky, elderly. "Dear Emily, your buddy brought me to church today. I haven't been since my Harold passed. Somehow, that dog of yours knew I needed to be here. Thank you for leaving us such a gift." The weight of his calling pressed heavily on his shoulders. As a priest, he was supposed to guide others through their spiritual journeys, to help them find meaning in loss and purpose in pain. Yet here he was, grappling with his own questions of heart and duty. Buddy shifted, moving to sit directly in front of him, their eyes meeting in the dim light. The dog's steady gaze seemed to hold wisdom beyond human understanding. Father John remembered Sarah's words about Emily. She said, "Animals know our hearts." The sound of footsteps made them both turn. Sarah stood in the chapel entrance, silhouetted by the hallway light. She held a stack of papers, final tallies from the fair, donation records, adoption statistics, but made no move to approach. "I thought I'd find you here," she said softly. "Both of you." She remained in the doorway, as if understanding that this moment of reflection needed its own space. Father John nodded, acknowledging her presence while remaining seated. Buddy looked between them, then settled back at Father John's feet, creating a bridge between the two humans who would become so important to him. The fair raised enough to support the shelter's operations for 6 months, Sarah continued, her voice carrying across the quiet space. Marie called it a miracle. She paused, then added more quietly, "Emily would have called it love." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Love for animals, love for community, love for those lost, and perhaps most challenging, the potential for new love growing in unexpected places. Father John stood slowly, his hand resting on Buddy's head. "Emily understood something most of us take years to learn," he said. "That love isn't diminished by being shared, it multiplies." Sarah took a step into the chapel, the papers clutched to her chest like a shield. "Is that what you believe, as a priest?" The question carried layers of meaning they both understood. As a priest, and as a man, he answered carefully. But believing something and knowing how to act on it are different challenges. Buddy moved between them, his tail wagging slowly, as if encouraging their conversation. The memorial altar cast soft shadows across their faces, Emily's smile watching over them. "I keep thinking about what we're building here," Sarah said. gesturing to the papers she held. It's not just about the animals anymore. It's about healing, about finding the courage to love again. Her voice trembled slightly. Emily always said that love was worth the risk. Father John felt the truth of those words in his core. Every day, he counseled others about faith, hope, and love. Now he found himself facing the most profound test of those principles in his own life. The chapel fell silent, except for Buddy's gentle breathing. Through the stained glass windows, the last light of day painted colors across the floor, creating a moment that felt both sacred and intensely human. The weeks following the fair brought a flurry of activity as the campaign reached its culmination. The final event would celebrate both Emily's life and Buddy's adoption. Father John and Sarah worked together to transform the church hall into a space that would honor both occasions, though neither spoke directly about their conversation in the chapel. One morning, while hanging string lights across the hall's wooden beams, Sarah shared the news. "I've completed the adoption paperwork for Buddy," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Marie said it should be finalized by the celebration. Father John steadied the ladder she stood on, acutely aware of her presence above him. "He's already chosen you," he replied, watching as Buddy dozed in a patch of sunlight nearby. "The paperwork just makes it official." The preparation for the event brought the entire community together. Mrs. Rodriguez organized a cooking committee, filling the church kitchen with the sense of homemade dishes. Martha Chen created a special cake decorated with paw prints and hearts. The teenager who had adopted the guinea pig designed event programs, featuring Emily's favorite quotes about animals and love. Between tasks, Father John found himself drafting and redrafting his speech. The words needed to honor Emily's memory while celebrating the community's journey forward. Each attempt felt inadequate until he realized he was approaching it from the wrong angle. "Stop trying to write a sermon," Sarah advised, finding him surrounded by crumpled papers in his office. "Just tell the truth about what Buddy showed us all." Her hand rested briefly on his shoulder, the touch lingering just long enough to convey understanding. The day before the celebration, Marie from the shelter visited to complete Buddy's adoption paperwork. She spread the documents across Father John's desk, each page representing another step toward making official what their hearts already knew. "Emily would be pleased," Marie said, watching Sarah sign her name with careful strokes. "She always said Buddy had more love to give than one person could handle." She glanced meaningfully between Sarah and Father John before adding, "Sometimes the best families are the ones we build ourselves." As Sarah completed the final signature, Buddy placed his paw on the paper, leaving a slight smudge. Instead of being upset, Sarah laughed, tears in her eyes. "That's perfect," she said. "He's signing too." The morning of the celebration arrived with unexpected warmth for the season. Early light streamed through the church windows as Father John prepared the space for the day ahead. He found Buddy sitting before Emily's memorial, as he had that first morning months ago. "You knew what we needed before we did, didn't you?" he asked the dog quietly. Buddy's tail thumped against the floor in response. People began arriving early, carrying dishes and decorations. The church hall filled with voices and laughter, the sound of a community healing together. Sarah moved through the crowd, accepting hugs and well wishes, Buddy following faithfully at her heels. Mrs. Rodriguez set up a memory table with photographs of beloved pets, both lost and found. The teenage girl organized a display of adoption success stories from the fair, each element wove together, creating a tapestry of love, loss, and renewal. As the official program approached, Father John observed the gathered crowd. He saw tears and smiles, heard laughter mixing with gentle words of comfort. The community had transformed, much like Buddy had transformed from a grieving dog to a symbol of hope and new beginnings. Sarah found him in a quiet moment before the ceremony. "Are you ready?" she asked, straightening his collar with familiar ease. The gesture felt intimate, domestic, and Father John caught himself wondering about paths not taken and choices yet to be made. "Emily once told me that ready isn't about feeling certain," she continued, her hands dropping to her sides. "It's about being willing to take the next step, even when you're scared." Buddy sat between them, his presence a reminder of the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The dog's adoption wasn't just about giving him a new home. It represented the possibility of new beginnings, of love surviving loss, of faith in the future despite the pain of the past. The celebration began with a moment of silence, but quickly transformed into something more vibrant, exactly as Emily would have wanted. Father John stood at the podium, looking out at the faces that had become more than just his congregation. They were now a family, bound together by shared experiences of loss and hope. "Emily Harrison," he began, his voice clear and strong, "taught us that love leaves footprints, or in this case, paw prints, that continue long after someone is gone." He gestured to Buddy, who sat proudly beside Sarah in the front row. "Through Buddy, she showed us that grief doesn't have to be the end of our story. It can be the beginning of a new chapter." Sarah's official adoption of Buddy was met with applause and happy tears. Marie from the shelter presented her with a new collar for Buddy, dark blue with a silver tag that caught the light. As Sarah knelt to put it on him, Buddy licked her face, causing laughter to ripple through the crowd. "Some of you might remember," Sarah said, standing to address the gathering, her hand resting on Buddy's head, "that Emily used to say, 'Animals choose their humans.' I think she was right, but I've learned something else too. Sometimes they choose entire communities." The event flowed naturally into a celebration of new beginnings. People shared stories of their own adopted pets, many from the recent fair. Mrs. Rodriguez brought her kitten, now confident enough to explore from her secure basket. The teenage girl's guinea pig had his own decorated corner, complete with fresh vegetables and admirers. Father John watched as Sarah moved through the crowd, Buddy at her side, both of them seemingly at peace with their new official status as family. He noticed how she'd stopped to share a memory of Emily with one person, offer comfort to another, her natural empathy drawing people to her. Later, as the celebration continued, they found themselves planning the next community event. "We could make it a regular thing," Sarah suggested, sketching ideas in her notebook. "Monthly adoption days, support groups for people who've lost pets, training classes. A continuing legacy," Father John agreed, aware of how close they were sitting, how natural it felt to be planning a future together, even if the exact nature of that future remained undefined. The plans they made that day would eventually become Emily's Hope, a permanent program running through both the church and the shelter. But for now, it was enough to watch their community healing, growing, and learning to love again. As the evening wound down, Buddy led them both to the memorial altar. The space had evolved over the months, becoming less a shrine to loss and more a testament to love's endurance. New photos had joined Emily's animals with their adoptive families, community members sharing their own stories of healing. "Ready to go home?" Sarah asked Buddy, who wagged his tail in response. The word home hung in the air, carrying new weight and meaning. Father John helped her gather Buddy's things: the leash, the new toys gifted by well-wishers, the scrapbook the community had made to commemorate the day. Their hands brushed as they worked, and neither pulled away immediately. "Emily would be proud," he said softly, "of all of us." Sarah nodded, tears shining in her eyes but a smile on her face. She would say, "This is exactly what love is supposed to do, grow and change and make room for more." As they walked to the church doors, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors. Buddy trotted between them, his new tag jingling softly. Other community members were leaving too, calling out good nights and making plans for future gatherings. Father John watched as Sarah and Buddy walked to her car, now officially a family. Something had shifted in all of them over these months, a healing that went beyond just coping with loss. They had learned, through Buddy's unwavering devotion and Emily's lasting legacy, that love was not a finite resource to be guarded, but a force that multiplied when shared. The church bells rang out the hour, their sound carrying across Maplewood, marking not an ending, but a continuation of love, of hope, of community, of possibility. The anonymous letter arrived exactly 1 month after Buddy's adoption celebration. Sarah found it in her mailbox on a Tuesday morning, unremarkable white envelope with no return address. She opened it while standing in her kitchen, Buddy dozing in his new bed nearby. The paper trembled in her hands as she read. "You all think Emily's death was an accident. Ask about the blue sedan that left the scene. Ask why the initial police report disappeared. Ask why certain people in Maplewood suddenly paid off their debts that week. Emily knew something she shouldn't have." Sarah read the letter 3 times, her coffee growing cold on the counter. Buddy, sensing her distress, came to press against her legs. Her first instinct was to call Father John. "Can you come over?" Her voice shook slightly when he answered, "I need to show you something." Father John arrived within 20 minutes, still wearing his collar from morning prayers. Sarah handed him the letter without comment, watching his face as he read. His expression darkened, jaw tightening. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" he asked, setting the letter carefully on her kitchen table. "No," Sarah replied. "I keep thinking about that day. Everyone said it was a hit and run, that the driver probably panicked. But Emily was always so careful when she walked Buddy." Father John sat heavily in one of Sarah's kitchen chairs. "I've heard rumors," he admitted reluctantly. "Things people say in confession that I can't." He trailed off, the conflict evident in his face. "But there's been talk about money changing hands at the local council around that time." Sarah paced her small kitchen, Buddy following her movements. "Emily mentioned something the week before she died. She said she'd seen something at the shelter records that didn't add up. I thought she was talking about donation discrepancies." "The shelter?" Father John leaned forward. "What kind of records?" "She was helping Marie organize their financial documents for a grant application." Sarah stopped pacing, her face pulling. "The week before she died, she asked me if I knew anything about large cash donations being used to hide money." The implications hung heavy in the kitchen air. Buddy went softly, picking up on the tension. Father John stood, moving to the window. The street outside looked peaceful, normal, but suddenly felt different. "If what you're suggesting is true," he said carefully, "we need to be very careful how we proceed. These kinds of accusations could tear the community apart." Sarah pulled out her phone, scrolling through old messages. "Here," she said, showing him a text from Emily. "Need to talk to you about something weird I found. Not shelter-related exactly, but connected. Don't mention this to anyone yet." The date, Father John noted, 3 days before the accident. They spent the next few hours piecing together what they knew. Emily's regular walking route, the mysterious blue sedan multiple people had mentioned seeing, the sudden disappearance of financial troubles for certain community members. "We have to tell someone," Sarah insisted, but Father John held up a hand. "We need proof first," he said. "If we start making accusations without evidence, we'll destroy the healing this community has experienced. We need to be strategic." As if understanding the gravity of the situation, Buddy retrieved his leash, dropping it at their feet. Sarah smiled despite her anxiety. "He always knows when we need to clear our heads." They walked through Maplewood's quiet streets, noting how normal everything appeared. Children played in front yards. Martha Chen was arranging displays in her bakery window. Mrs. Rodriguez waved from her porch. "How many of them know something?" Sarah whispered. "How many have been carrying this secret?" Father John touched her arm gently. "We'll find out. But we have to be careful. Emily would want us to protect the community she loved, even while seeking the truth." When they returned to Sarah's house, they found another envelope had been slipped under her door. This one contained a single photograph, Emily's car on the day of the accident, and in the background, a partial license plate number. "Someone else knows," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her fear. "And they want us to find out the truth." Father John stared at the photograph, his role as priest and seeker of justice warring within him. Buddy pressed against both their legs, creating a circle of connection that somehow made them stronger. "We'll need help," Father John finally said. "People we can trust, absolutely." He paused, looking at the evidence spread across Sarah's kitchen table. "This could change everything we've built." The culmination of their investigation came during the one-year memorial service for Emily. Father John had planned it as a celebration of her life and the community's growth, but now it served a dual purpose. They knew the person responsible would be there. Community events were mandatory for council members. The church filled quickly that evening. Sarah sat in the front row, Buddy beside her, both watching as people filed in. They had spent weeks carefully gathering information. Bank records Marie had found buried in shelter files, witness statements collected discreetly, and most damning, a series of photographs showing Councilman James Porter's blue sedan with front-end damage being repaired the day after Emily's death. Father John began the service with a prayer, his voice steady despite knowing what was to come. "Emily Harrison taught us about love," he said, looking out at the gathered faces, "but she also believed in truth, in justice, in standing up for what's right." In the third row, Councilman Porter shifted uncomfortably. His wife touched his arm, concerned by his obvious distress. They had tracked the money trail to his accounts. Large deposits that coincided with missing shelter donations, followed by suspicious payments to other council members. "Emily discovered something in those shelter records," Father John continued, departing from his planned speech. "Something that worried her enough to make notes, to take photographs, to prepare evidence." The tension in the church grew palpable. Sarah stood, holding a folder. "Emily found proof that the shelter's donations were being used to launder money," she announced, her voice clear and strong. "Money that was supposed to help animals was being filtered through fake accounts, cleaned, and redistributed." Councilman Porter stood abruptly. "This is inappropriate," he declared, his face flushed. "This is meant to be a memorial service." "Yes," Father John agreed. "A memorial for a woman who died trying to expose corruption. A woman who was struck by a blue sedan, your blue sedan, James, while walking home from the shelter with evidence." The congregation erupted in whispers and gasps. Buddy, normally calm, stood and barked once, sharply, at Porter. The sound echoed through the church like an accusation. "It was an accident," Porter suddenly blurted, his composure cracking. "I didn't mean to." She stepped out suddenly. "I'd only meant to scare her, to get her to drop the investigation. I didn't mean to hit her." His wife pulled away from him in horror. Several people stood, including Marie from the shelter, who had helped gather the final pieces of evidence. "I couldn't sleep," Porter continued, words tumbling out. "Every time I saw that dog at her memorial, every time I heard about the campaign, the guilt was destroying me, but I couldn't confess. Too many people were involved, too much money." Father John descended from the pulpit, approaching Porter slowly. "Confession isn't just about words," he said quietly. "It's about actions, about making things right." Sarah walked forward to Buddy at her side. "Emily believed in forgiveness," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "but she also believed in justice." Porter looked around the church, at the faces of people he'd known his whole life. Then, slowly, he walked to the center aisle. "I'm ready," he said, pulling out his phone, "to tell everything. About the money laundering, about the accident, about all of it." The next hours passed in a blur of police statements and revelations. Several council members were implicated in the money laundering scheme. The truth about Emily's death finally came to light, bringing both pain and relief to the community. Later that night, after the police had gone and the church had emptied, Father John, Sarah, and Buddy sat on the church steps. The truth had been costly. Respected community members would face charges. Relationships were damaged. Trust would need to be rebuilt. Was it worth it? Sarah asked softly, her hand buried in Buddy's fur. Father John looked at her, then at the stars above. Emily once told me that love without truth isn't really love at all. It's just comfort. Buddy lay between them, his head on Sarah's lap, his tail touching Father John's leg. They had uncovered the truth, but they had also discovered something else. That real love, like real faith, can withstand the hard truths and emerge stronger. The community will heal, Father John said finally. Different this time. Better. Because now we're healing with truth as our foundation. Sarah reached for his hand, and this time, neither of them pulled away. Buddy sighed contentedly between them, a symbol of faithfulness that had led them not only to love, but to truth. Above them, the church bells tolled midnight, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. In the distance, Maplewood lay quiet, changed forever but ultimately stronger, much like the three souls sitting in the starlight, bound together by love, truth, and the unwavering devotion of a dog who had led them all home.